This video will be about two new ways to declare variables in JavaScript. So the old way is with var. So var stands for variable, of course. And we will first have a look at what the problem with var is and why let and const, the new two ways to declare variables in JavaScript in ES6, why this was established and why it makes sense. So let's first have a look at the old way, with the var way. We will declare a variable here. So this will be, let's say, x, and x will be set to 1, let's say. So nothing unusual here, and I would just put out this x value here with this console log. Okay, so let's check this in the browser. And here in the browser, I will open the Chrome DevTools here. So you can do this with right mouse click inspect, or you can press F12. And here we go to the console. Here we can see main.js. Line 3, and we have this output here, so everything works okay. But what happens if I move this console log to this place here? So first I'll do the console log with x, and then I'll do the var x equals 1. So here we can see now that x is undefined. So there's no error, but x is undefined. Now you could say, okay, the browser doesn't throw an error if there is an undefined variable here or not declared variable here. So let's just remove this line here and see what happens there in the browser. No, we have an error, uncalled reference error, x is not defined. So the browser here complains, the JavaScript runtime here complains that x is not defined, which is correct. Obviously, you need to define a variable here to access it. You can define it later here with var and then access it before you have declared it. And that could be, of course, a problem in your code. So the browser not throwing an error in this case here is not very helpful to find errors. This doesn't make any sense. And also, if we check again, x is undefined, which is of course clear because it is defined in this line here. And before x is a known variable, but it has no value since the value is given in this line. So from the perspective of the browser, everything is okay. You have the variable declaration here. So it seems it doesn't matter when this variable declaration comes. As long as it is there, it can come later. And the value, of course, is not set before this line here, but the value is, of course, undefined. This is also called hoisting of variables. So this variable declaration is kind of moved to the top here. This is like doing something like this, var, and then here we have the assignment of the value. So this is the same. The variable is declared here at the top, and then the value is assigned later. We can check in the browser that this is really the same here. So also x is undefined. And if we put this console log here after this line, we can see first it's undefined and then it is 1. Okay, so that's the behavior of the var declaration. And as I said, this could be problematic because it will cover up kind of some mistakes you could make. So access a variable before it is declared. And this is one reason why let and const are established in ES6. So let's do the same with let. I would just use here let instead of var and then do the console log here in the first line. And then after the let, I will do it again. So let's see what the browser says. And here we have an error, cannot access x before initialization. Even though this is an error, this is good because we can find, or the browser tells us that probably this is not what you intended in your code because you're accessing this variable before it is declared. So if you want to do something like that, you have to do it like this. So first the let, and you can also, if you really want it to be undefined at the beginning, you can define it here. So this is the declaration of x, and this is the definition, the assignment to the initial value. Here the initial value would be undefined, of course, and here it is set to 1. So this is okay. And here we have the same output as for the var example. So what let gives us here is catching of errors that occur whenever whenever you access a variable before its declaration. So if you do it something like this with let, there will be an error. You have to move the accessing of the variable after the let, then it's okay. Like this, it's okay. And what you can do with var is no longer allowed. That is one thing that let gives us. So our code will be hopefully better by catching these errors early. But this is not the only thing we get with let. There's one more thing that is important, and this is block scope. Now, for explaining the block scope, we need a block scope first. So we will make one here. I will just write if true, and we have the curly braces here, which in JavaScript are used to define blocks. So inside here, we have code that is inside this block, and we will put this here. And let's say we will use a different value here, so we'll set this to 0. And let's first not use let, but var again. So let's go back to the old way of doing this. And the console log will be outside this block scope here at the end. Okay, what are we doing here? We can also do it like that. We are defining and declaring x to be 1, and then inside here we can do the same. So also var x equals 1, var x equals 0 here, and then at the end outside of the scope here we will console log x, the value of x, and see what happens. So we have two variable declarations here, one in this scope, in the top scope, and one inside the curly braces here in this inner scope, so to speak. So let's see what the browser tells us, what the value of x is at the end, and it is 0. So let's see, why is it 0? Here it is set to 1, then if true, it is also set to 0 here. So this is the last value, and then it is output. Why is that important? Because here we have a block scope, and if we declare a variable, the same variable that we have here inside this block scope, this is not local to this scope, obviously, because here we are redeclaring x to be 0, and this is the same x here and here. So we are not declaring this x for this scope here inside, but we are changing the value of this outer scope x. So obviously this means that you cannot have variables with the same name inside this scope here. So this scope here, this block scope, won't be respected by the variable declaration here with var. So here we are not defining another variable x inside the scope, but we are just redeclaring this x and setting it to 0. So this is probably not what you wanted, because you have written twice the var. Probably what you wanted here is a local variable here in this local scope. So this could be also a while or a for, whatever, and you wanted to declare a variable inside this while scope here inside the curly braces. But this is unfortunately not how var works, and this is why we do the same here with let now, and let's see what the difference is. I'm declaring with let here x and set it to 1, and inside this block scope here I'm also doing the let x, but this time I will set it to 0. And let's also put a console log here after this, so we are outputting here the inner x, and here we are outputting the outer x. Okay, let's check in the browser, and we have the inner x is 0 and the outer x is 1. So this is actually what I wanted here. Have this x local to this scope and have this x for the outer scope. And this is also what causes lesser problems than the declaration with var, because with var you're not respecting the scope of these curly braces here, but actually you are redeclaring the same variable here inside this scope, and of course setting it to a different value here. And if you use let and if you use const also, this will be a local declaration for this scope here. Now let's go back to using var here again, because I want to show something else. So we have these two var declarations, and I will remove this one here. And here you can also see how the scope interacts with the other feature of let. Here we don't have an error, but everything seems to be okay for the browser, for the runtime. Inner X is 0, outer X is also 0, no error. And this is not what most of the people expected, I would say, because this declaration here is inside the scope, but it's kind of leaking outside here, and it can also be used here. So X is declared here. And if we change that to let, then we can see there is a reference error. X is not defined. So we can see clearly here that this X is only accessible here inside the scope. And we can also leave that if out here, so just have the curly braces, and this will also define a scope here. So the same here, we also have this error, so you don't have to do something like if true to define a scope. It's enough to have these curly braces here. Where can you use something like this? For example, very useful in a switch. So let's define Y here and then do a switch Y. And then we have a case, so case 2 for example, and then break. And if you want to define something here or want to use something here inside this case, you could of course do something like this here. But if you don't want to let this X declaration leak, for example, to the next case, so if we would do something like this, and we would also do let X equals 1, here we have immediately the error, and Visual Studio Code in this case is also telling us that you cannot redeclare a block scope variable X because this is the same scope here. Here we have the curly braces, and how to solve this is just use the curly braces here inside the case, and then you have two local variables here, and like this it's completely okay. So you can use the curly braces to create your own scope here and have local variables inside the scope. So let's get to const. So we have let now, and everything that was told here about let, so the block scope, and also that you cannot access variables before the initialization. This is also true for const. So let's clear this thing up a bit. Let's get rid of that here, so that we just have, let's say we just have this scope here. As we have learned, we can make a scope here inside this module. It's not necessary in this case, but let's do it like that. And inside this scope, we can define a variable and also define a const variable. So let's do this. We have X equals 1. And what does const mean? Of course, const means that this is constant. So can I change this variable later? In the next line, for example, let's check. And no, we cannot. Assignment to constant variable. This is what the browser says. The runtime throws as an error here. And this is good because the intention here is that this value won't change after initialization. This also means that something like this doesn't make any sense because we are not assigning a value here. And this is also what Visual Studio Code here says. Const declarations must be initialized. Otherwise, they won't have a value and everything is always undefined then. And that doesn't make any sense. I have to assign a initial value here and later I cannot change it. So this is not allowed, of course, or something like this won't be allowed either. Assignment to constant variable also here and here. Unfortunately, Visual Studio Code in my case here at least is not telling me that this cannot be done or this will lead to an error, but you see it in the browser. Okay, so what does that mean if you use something like this? So we are declaring an object literal here. So X will be an object. And what about this? I'm defining a property inside this object and let's set it to hello. Is this allowed or is it throwing an error? We check. This is totally okay. And of course we can also output the value of A here and it should be hello, as we can see here. What does that mean? Const X equals this object literal. What is const here in this case is the reference to this object literal here, or the reference to this object. So what you do inside the object is not const. And also what I cannot do here is of course set it to a new object. So this will still give me an error assignment to constant variable. And the same is also true for an array here. If I do, let's say, push to this array, push hello to the array, and then we output the array, we get this hello inside the array. So push is totally okay here. And also, of course, changing of, let's say, the first element is also okay. No error, everything fine. Why should you use const? In my experience, you can per default use const unless you need let. So why is this advice making sense? At least for me, very often you have something like this here, for example. So you declare an object maybe, or an array like this, and then you're pushing or you're changing with the object, you're changing properties inside the object. And this is also totally fine with const. You don't have to use let in this case. You can use let, but you should use let whenever you are sure that you will later change the variable. In this case, I'm setting x to an empty array, and here I'm setting it to this empty object. So this is okay if you use let. Of course, it's not okay if you use const. So this will give me uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. And if I use let, of course, not okay to push inside an object. So I can't do this, but I can do this here. So why should you use const? Because when using const, you're stating that your variable here is not changing, and this will give the browser or the runtime the opportunity to give you hints whenever you're not adhering to this. You say this should be const and then later reassign it. This is probably an error. Either you change it really to let to change the variable later, or maybe it was a mistake to assign a different value here. What is the case? You need to decide, of course, but you're giving the browser more opportunities to find errors and not to cover up errors. So if you use let, this could happen. So first use x for an array, and then later accidentally you are using it to store this reference to this object here, for example. And the second reason why you should use probably const is that you also give the runtime or the just-in-time compiler inside the browser the opportunity to optimize the code that it is producing. So if you say this is const here, then the compiler knows that this won't change and also that the type won't change. So x will always be this array. Otherwise, this would not be allowed. So the compiler, the JavaScript or runtime compiler, can optimize for this case because the type here is set to array or whatever you set here, in this case then number. But in my opinion, most of the time you can use const because, for example, this is very often you call a function, for example, do it, and it has a return value, and you just want to capture the return value here and then later use it. So for example, if result, and do something here and then output, for example, result, and result won't change because it's just here for checking if this is really not undefined or empty strings, something like that, and then outputting it to the console. So this is okay, and also the just-in-time compiler can optimize for this case, can optimize for the const here. So let's summarize let and const. What are the advantages of using let and const? So first advantage is you can catch early access errors like this here. So if you do the let, the declaration and initialization of x here, you cannot access x before that line, which is in almost all cases wrong here. And now with using let, the compiler or the browser runtime will let you know that. So this is very nice because you can catch errors without debugging. And the second advantage is, of course, the block scope. So let's check again what this means. We have this block scope here. We have the block with the curly braces, and then inside we have result. And this will be assigned the get that return value here, and then it will be logged to the console. And in the outer scope here, in the top level scope, we have also result here, which will get the value from this function. And then later, after this scope, it will console log this result. And then here we have the correct outputs, which means that here we really have a local variable local to that scope. There is no leaking of this here inside to the outer scope. Should you use var still for some cases? I would say no, not necessary. Maybe there are cases where it is necessary, or maybe it is better to use var. In my opinion, in 99% of the cases, you can avoid using var and always use let or const. If you want to assure that a value is not changed afterwards, use const. I would say also 90% of the cases you can use const, and only if you want to change a variable later, then use let. So if you use var, the JavaScript runtime will hoist your variable declaration to the top, which is also the case for this here, for function. So as you can see here, I have two function declarations at the end, and you can use these functions here before the actual declaration. Should you avoid using this here at the end and put it here? That's a personal preference. I would say no, this is not necessary. I will always put it down here. Why? Because here we have a greater abstraction level. This is more implementation detail here. So if you read the code, you will always first get the calling of this function. And if you want to know what this function is about in detail, you can get to the declaration here below. In Visual Studio Code, this is F12, by the way. But if you don't want to know the details of this function call, but you are satisfied with the name here, so this is not a very good name, but let's say this is telling you what this function does and what it returns, then you don't have to go through the implementation of the function here. So if you imagine having, let's say, 20 functions here at the top, and then you have to scroll down to get to the actual code that is first executed, then I wouldn't write it like that, but put all the declarations here. So these function declarations will be hoisted by the runtime and will be available here at the top. So this is let and const. In my opinion, this really replaces the old var, so you should avoid using var whenever you can, and I think you can avoid it 99% of the time.